Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. The webinar will begin in just a few minutes. We'll start right at 10 a.m. Please note that all attendees will be muted throughout the entire session, but you can use the Q&A feature in WebEx to ask questions. Good morning, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us for today's webinar, Understanding the Fundamentals of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG-DR Program. This webinar will provide an overview of the CDBG-DR program, a summary of the activities being funded through the program in the U.S. Virgin Islands, and information on how local nonprofits and other stakeholders can get involved. My name is Jelani Newton, and I'm a Senior Program Director here at Enterprise Community Partners. I'll be your host this morning. I'm also a proud native of the Virgin Islands. I was born and raised on St. Croix, and most of my family still lives on the island, so this work is very important and also deeply personal to me. For those that may not be familiar with Enterprise, we're a national nonprofit focused on housing and community development. We are headquartered in Columbia, Maryland, with offices across the country. We work throughout the United States and in the U.S. Caribbean to promote affordable and quality housing that connects people to opportunity. With support from various national foundations, our team has been working in both Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands to support recovery from Hurricanes Maria and Irma, with a particular focus on promoting resilience and equity in the housing recovery. I should mention that today's webinar is possible thanks to a grant from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. I'll also mention that none of our work in the VI would be possible without the continued engagement of local partners like the VI Housing Finance Authority and several others. In fact, the webinar we're going to host today was actually proposed by the folks at the VI Housing Finance Authority, who recognize a desire among the local nonprofits and other community stakeholders for this information. So we're very excited to partner with them today in delivering this content, and we hope you'll find it useful. Today's session will feature presentations from Marion McFadden, Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Senior Advisor for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners, and Antoinette Fleming, CDBG-DR Director for the VI Housing Finance Authority. Over the course of the next 90 minutes or so, the session will provide an overview of the CDBG-DR program nationally. We'll spend some time going into the specific programs outlined in the VI's action plan across the program sectors of housing, infrastructure, and economic revitalization. And we'll also talk about opportunities for local nonprofits and other community stakeholders to engage through CDBG-DR in the recovery process. We'll also reserve some time at the end of the session for questions and answers. Before we move into the first presentation, I wanted to mention a few quick housekeeping notes. First, please note that all attendees will be muted throughout the session, but questions can be sent to the speakers via the Q&A panel at the lower right-hand side of your screen. If you see the word letters Q&A, right next to it is a right arrow. If you click the arrow, it'll expand the Q&A window, and you can post your questions in there. Please make sure when you send your questions, you send them to all panelists, and we'll make sure to answer those questions during the Q&A portion of the session. Another note, for the best audio quality, please connect to the webinar audio through your phone line and do not use the computer audio. In the past, we've found this to produce a better quality audio for participants. Next, I wanted to give a big thank you to Michelle Juma here at Enterprise, who's handling the technical side of the WebEx system for us. You'll see her name in the panelist list. I also wanted to thank Josh Childs on our team for all his work helping to pull the session together. And last note, the webinar is being recorded, and both the slides and the recording will be available after the session. With that, I would like to introduce our first presenter. Marion McFadden serves as Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Senior Advisor for Resilience here at Enterprise. She's worked with the CDBG-DR program since 9/11. Previously, she served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Grant Programs at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, and while at HUD, she oversaw affordable housing and community development programs, including the CDBG program, the Home Investment Partnerships program, the Housing Trust Fund, the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, and CDBG-DR funds, including Hurricane Sandy and National Disaster Resilience Competition grants. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marion. I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Jelani, and hello, everyone. First thing I'd like to say off the bat is if you didn't know that HUD does disaster recovery, you're not alone. It comes as a surprise to many communities that HUD is involved. People tend to think about FEMA when it comes to disaster response and recovery. But over the years, we've seen that Congress has been providing more and more dollars to HUD in order to do the long-term recovery work. So HUD dollars aren't on the ground immediately. It takes some time for funds to flow from Congress to HUD and then down to individual state, local governments, and tribes. But we're going to go talk in depth about the great things that can happen once those dollars reach communities. Okay, so first question, what is CDBG-DR? There is no permanent authorization for HUD to do disaster recovery. We do have bills in the House and the Senate that would make this a permanent program, but the way it works right now is that after the biggest natural disasters, Congress has the option to make funding available. So that certainly happened to address Hurricanes Irma and Maria, and we've seen for many other disasters as well. So Congress appropriates those dollars, and the special appropriation provides funding for the most impacted and distressed areas, or MIDs, that have significant unmet needs for long-term disaster recovery. In practice, the way that works is the Congress gives the HUD Secretary discretion to dig into the data and make the decisions about which jurisdictions receive the funding. Some parts of the CDBG-DR program are the same as the annual CDBG or Community Development Block Grant Program. We'll talk a little bit about some of the differences. But like the annual program for CDBG disaster recovery, once those funds flow to a local government or a state government, they become the grantee. So when you hear us talk about grantee, that means the unit of government that is receiving funding If I say recipient or subrecipient, that means someone that has received funding not directly from HUD, but through that government that has received the funding from HUD. So like the annual CDBG program, a CDBG-DR grantee is responsible for creating, publishing, and submitting to HUD an action plan for how it will use the dollars. But before it can submit that plan to HUD, the jurisdiction is responsible for publishing a draft and oftentimes doing one or more public hearings so that citizens can review and offer comments, and the grantee then takes those comments into consideration and makes revisions before submitting that plan to HUD. HUD reviews the plan and either accepts or rejects the action plan. If they reject the plan, they bounce it back to the grantee to make whatever changes are required to be in compliance with the law. And then once the plan is accepted, the money moves from HUD to that jurisdiction. Like the annual CDBG program, all of the funds have to meet one of three categories. So the funds have to either benefit people of low and moderate income, prevent or eliminate slums and blight, or meet an other urgent community development need. Overall, the grant will have to benefit people of low and moderate income. There is an overall benefit requirement with each grant. Usually it is that 80% of the funds have to primarily benefit people of low and moderate income. I say usually because Congress has the ability to change from law to law, but generally that is the rule. We'll talk about waivers a little bit later in the webinar, so there are always exceptions here. But some of the funds are not going to have to meet the low and moderate income benefit requirement, and that's where we see looking at other national objectives, the prevention or elimination of slums and blight, or meeting an other urgent community development need. So, generally when Congress provides the funds to HUD, they say that the funds must be used for necessary expenses related to disaster relief, long-term recovery, and restoration of infrastructure, housing, and economic revitalization. Basically, that covers almost anything a community needs after a disaster. There are very few activities that cannot fall within those categories. We'll talk about what's in and what's out, but just keep in mind it's very flexible money. That's why CDBG dollars are beloved at by communities all over the country, and particularly why Congress uses this vehicle after disasters, this flexibility, this large menu of activities that communities can choose from. I'll highlight here that it's important that there is a tie back to the disaster or the disasters that gave rise to the eligibility for the funds. So they have to design activities that are going to address disaster-related impacts. However, with this most recent funding, including funding that's going to the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and others for mitigation, Congress has been forward-looking, not just backward-looking. So it's up to the jurisdiction to make the case for how the funds are either addressing disaster-related impacts or mitigating the community against reasonable, foreseeable hazards. So on this slide, you'll see an example of some eligible activities, and we see communities all over the country that use their funds for these kinds of disaster-related recovery activities. So large-scale and small-scale infrastructure projects. For example, a small infrastructure project could be as simple as repairing a sidewalk or a sewer line that had been damaged, or a large-scale infrastructure could be as big as rebuilding a port. Economic development projects, for example, working capital or repair to damaged businesses, or even assistance to small businesses that were not directly damaged but are necessary for the recovery of a community. Installation of public facilities and support for community centers. Certainly one of the largest activities we see after disasters, housing rehabilitation. Ordinarily, in the CDBG program, it's very difficult to do new housing construction. However, HUD always grants a waiver to allow jurisdictions to do new housing construction after disasters. Public services are eligible, clearance and demolition, acquisition of new properties, additional assistance to micro enterprises, doing code enforcement, and assistance to homeowners. So those are just a few examples of the types of eligible activities. Generally, the sky is the limit with a few caveats. So there are some activities which are explicitly prohibited even after disasters. So buildings for the general conduct of government, things like City Hall, are generally not going to be able to be assisted with CDBG disaster recovery assistance. There is an opportunity for waivers, which we'll talk about in a minute, but these are generally ineligible. The general expenses of government are not eligible. So the kinds of government activities that were being paid for before the disaster can't suddenly be covered by CDBG-DR funds. Political activities are always prohibited. Generally, purchasing equipment, including construction equipment and fire equipment, is ineligible. That's something that sometimes causes frustration among grantees. They say we want to buy new equipment, but generally they're ineligible under HUD dollars. They can be eligible under FEMA sometimes, but not under the HUD CDBG-DR. Furnishings and personal property are ineligible. Also, that can be a real cause of frustration at the individual level. People think that they should be able to use their disaster funding to get back their personal property. That is eligible under FEMA individual assistance, but not under CDBG-DR funding. Ongoing operating and maintenance costs, generally not eligible. And under the annual program, new housing construction is ineligible, and it's ineligible in CDBG-DR only until HUD grants a waiver in the Federal Register, which has happened now for the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico, but just a caveat there, until HUD does issue those waivers, it's not eligible for communities. And then generally projects that don't fall into one of those three national objectives that we talked about, preventing slums and blight, meeting urgent community development needs, or serving low and moderate income people. If you can't get an activity into one of those three buckets, it's not eligible. And then generally income payments, so just providing subsistence payments to families is not generally eligible. For a short period of time, it can be eligible, but not for a long period of time. Okay, so if you're familiar at all with federal dollars, you know that they come with a lot of related requirements and a lot of paperwork. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the cross-cutting federal requirements that grantees are responsible for complying with. Environmental review is one of the most complained about requirements that I hear from communities. So certainly we all understand the importance of, for example, protecting wetlands and protecting endangered species and making sure that the quality of the place where you're, for example, building housing is going to be sufficient. However, the environmental review requirements don't have the ability to be waived. So there are waivers available for lots of requirements, but by statute, Congress says no waiver of environmental reviews, and so the result is that complying with environmental review adds cost and time to what it takes to get projects done. And so there is no real additional flexibility generally available on environmental review. Flood insurance is also a requirement that tends to come as a surprise to some communities that are receiving CDBG-DR for the first time, and that extends to the individual homeowner level. If a property is in a floodplain, and funds are used to substantially improve the property or new constructed property, you're going to have to comply with flood insurance requirements, meaning the purchase of a flood insurance policy, and the property owner is required to obtain and maintain that flood insurance. So it's not just a one-year policy that's required, but it's generally continued over the useful life of the property. And so that adds an ongoing cost for property owners, which is not covered by the grant. However, one of the things we've seen is that where CDBG-DR funds are used to elevate properties that are in the floodplains, which HUD also requires, if it's a property that's being substantially reconstructed or newly constructed, having that elevation makes flood insurance incredibly affordable. It brings the cost way, way down, so it may be in the best financial interest of the property owner to have that flood insurance over time and affordable. Labor standards are requirements under the Davis-Bacon Act, and those relate to how much workers under federal contracts are paid. Section 3 is a HUD-specific requirement that residents of public housing and other low-income residents of the area be given an opportunity for training and construction-related projects. There are also cross-cutting Federal Funding Accountability and Transparency Act requirements, which are essentially that the jurisdiction has to record what's going on in a project on a federal website. There are procurement requirements. This is another one that tends to cause some headaches about what it takes to get contractors, and fair and open bidding requirements and related. And generally, I think the concern that jurisdictions have is that it adds time to the process, but not a lot of waivers available there. Then there are also lead-based paint requirements, so older housing is going to have to be checked to make sure that there's no lead-based paint that could be impacting the health of residents, particularly young children. It's very important to ensure that paint is in good quality condition, and so HUD will require that. There are fair housing requirements under the Fair Housing Act. This is one of the kinds of requirements that cannot be waived, and so HUD has requirements on the books. Generally, the fair housing requirements for CDBG-DR are the same as what they would be for the annual CDBG program. There are relocation requirements, so this is where a family has to move out of their home. If that is attributable to the federal assistance, making it that they have to move, then there are responsibilities that the grantee takes on to get them moved and suitably rehoused on a temporary or permanent basis. There are accessibility requirements. These are related to disability needs for residents who are moving in, and equal opportunity requirements as well, and those are going to be the same as under the annual HUD programs. Okay, so speaking of paperwork requirements, HUD is going to ensure that jurisdictions are complying with all of the Office of Management and Budget requirements in Part 200 of 2 CFR. So in order to even receive funds in the first place, the jurisdictions have to demonstrate that they have financial and internal controls, procurement, independent cost estimates, accounting procedures, cost principles and audit requirements, timely expenditure of funds, including program income, performance measurements, and written agreements. And they demonstrate that by showing that they have suitable policies to comply with all of these different areas of the OMB requirements. In addition, HUD requires grantees to prepare financial forecasts by program and to project expenditures and measure their progress. So if you are not a government employee and you are a community member, please have some empathy in your heart for when it feels like programs are running a little bit slowly, that the government officials have to comply with all of these requirements, because You know, there is not a streamlined process available right now for jurisdictions. They have to go individually through each of these requirements and comply, and they will receive visits from the Inspector General and from the HUD staff to look through their paperwork and their books. And if they fail to comply, that comes at the cost of potentially having to pay HUD back for any money that was spent on a program or an activity where they don't have the paperwork to back it up. And that really gets down to the individual receipt level that they have to demonstrate compliance. This is a way that HUD is ensuring that taxpayer dollars are protected and that funds are going to exactly the activities that they need to go to. I'm going to talk in just a minute about duplication of benefits, but before I do that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it means that HUD can offer waivers. So under the statute that provides the disaster recovery money, the HUD Secretary gets a special authority to waive any statutes or regulations that the HUD Secretary administers, except for non-discrimination, labor standards, and the environment. So that's where we see some ability to go back to the requirements and say, we're going to streamline certain parts of the program. So, for example, on citizen participation, they may shorten the period of time for citizen participation in order to get those dollars turned around more quickly. But we don't see waivers of the kinds of financial management requirements that are required to demonstrate that the funds were properly used. So, the grantees are going to enter all of their documents into a system called DRGR, which stands for the Disaster Recovery Grant Reporting System. And then they're going to use that system to access their line of credit, enter their action plans, and any changes to the action plans. Now, I should mention that if a community puts an action plan into HUD and gets it approved, they still have the flexibility to make small changes. They don't have to go out for public comment on small changes. But if a change is going to be considered substantial, if they're going to be moving a lot of dollars between categories, or if they're going to be taking funding out of one category and putting it into another in a large way, they have to go back out for public comment. So they put those into the system, and then they also do their quarterly progress reports. You can go onto HUD's website and view updates from jurisdictions, and HUD also requires jurisdictions to maintain their own websites to provide key information about the receipts. And these records are going to have to be maintained for a long time. So the records retention requirement is for 3 years following grant closeout. But grant closeout may take many, many years. So just as an example, the grant funding that was provided to the state of New York for 9/11 recovery, so after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001, those grants are still open. So these are long-term recovery programs that may take a decade or more in some cases. But like I said, the laws change from time to time, so some of the jurisdictions have a hard deadline for expenditure on them, and some have a soft deadline for expenditure where there are waivers available from the Office of Management and Budget, so there's no single rule here. Okay, so the last major requirement here that I want to talk about is the duplication of benefits prohibition. So under both the Robert T. Stafford Act and the laws that provide the funding to HUD, grantees are prohibited from spending money in a way that would allow a recipient, so that could be a nonprofit, or it could be an individual family, or it could be a small business. So it prohibits them from receiving more disaster assistance than the amount of the loss, or receiving benefits for a loss that has already been covered by another source. This is known as the Duplication of Benefits prohibition, also called DOB. It includes both private and public sources in terms of looking at what's been received. So for example, if a homeowner has received insurance proceeds, an amount sufficient to cover their rebuilding, they're not able to receive additional grant dollars for that rebuilding. And the purpose of this rule is to ensure that the federal government funding is the last source of recovery funding made available. Unfortunately, the Congress has not provided enough funding to ensure that no one has to tap into their other sources of benefits like insurance. This tends to be a little bit confusing to folks, so I'll just walk through a couple of examples here. So let's say an individual home, a single-family home, has a rehabilitation need after a disaster of $50,000, but received $50,000 from insurance. There is $0 left, and so no eligibility for CDBG disaster recovery funding. But let's take a second example. Let's say that the rehabilitation cost for that single-family home is $50,000, but FEMA has already provided $20,000 that can be used for rebuilding. So we're not talking about the FEMA dollars that have been used for temporary sheltering costs, like paying for a hotel, for example, or other emergency needs. But let's say there's $20,000 still available from a FEMA grant. That means that the total eligibility for CDBG-DR is $30,000. That's okay. That family can receive that $30,000. Generally, the costs of rebuilding are going to be to put the home back to the same sort of size that it was previously, but there's actually some flexibility at the local jurisdiction if it would be appropriate to serve a family a little bit different than the original kind of footprint of their home. There's some flexibility there. So those are the key provisions of duplication of benefits. I don't want to take too much time here, but I'm looking forward to questions when the opportunity arrives and discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Marion. For the attendees, again, please remember to post your questions for Marion to the Q&A panel on the lower right-hand side of your screen, and we'll address all questions in the designated time at the end of the webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Ms. Antoinette Fleming. Ms. Fleming serves as Director of the CDBG-DR Program at the VI Housing Finance Authority. Through various programs and projects, the VI HFA seeks to increase access to housing and community development opportunities in the Virgin Islands. At the HFA, Ms. Fleming leads the team that administers the CDBG-DR funds on behalf of the territory government. Thanks so much for joining us, Ms. Fleming. I'm going to hand the virtual mic over to you so that you can take us through your presentation.
All right. Thank you, Jelani, and thank you, Enterprise, for this opportunity. So my portion of the presentation, as Jelani mentioned, will talk about the CDBG-DR program in the USDI. Now, the purpose of the CDBG-DR funds is to address the unmet needs in the U.S. The U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development has awarded about $1.8 billion, that is, of CDBG-DR funds to the USDI. Now, CDBG-DR funds are intended to address unmet needs in housing, infrastructure, and economic revitalization that were impacted as a result of the 2017 storms. The next slide will show us a breakdown on how that allocation is presented to us. As I mentioned before, the first tranche was $242 million, and that was to address the unmet needs in the territory. Governor Mapp signed that grant agreement back in September 2017. That was Tranche 1. What the territory is currently awaiting is Tranche 2, which is projected to have about $779 million. That HUD approved that funding back on March 1st, 2019. However, as of this date, we have not received the grant agreement for now Governor Bryan to sign and execute so we can have access to those funds in the territory. For Tranche 3 and Tranche 4, which are upcoming in HUD, for HUD to give us, Tranche 3 is going to address what we call mitigation measures. And HUD has given us an assurance here in the territory that the Federal Register notice will be given to us by September 4th, 2019. With that Federal Register notice, we will be given guidelines on how to proceed and how to implement projects. Tranche 4 will be giving at another date, and that is to address the electrical power system here in the territory. I'm going to go on to the next slide. So the overall benefit for the DR program, HUD requires that 70% of Tranche 1 is used to benefit primarily low to moderate income individuals. And when I say primarily, they have specifically told us 70% of the funds, low to moderate. This also means that we can serve people that exceed the income limit, but that is limited to just 30% of the funding allocation. On this next slide, this is a very detailed breakdown of how our tranches is broken down. On this slide, we're looking at housing, infrastructure, and economic revitalization, as these were the most impacted in the territory. For our housing program, we have identified 5 activities that will serve the public in trying to rehabilitate single-family homes, new construction, rental properties, multifamily structures, and also the vulnerable population that are listed under the supportive housing and sheltering program. So for a deeper dive, under our housing, we have the homeowner program. The funding allocation from Tranche 1 is $10 million. What is shown in the next column as $8 million, we have told HUD that 80% of those funds would benefit low to moderate income individuals. When we go down to the second line item, the new construction for homeownership opportunities, this program mimics our traditional VIHFA program. The allocation for this is also $10 million. And in this program, we have identified $9 million that would benefit low to moderate income individuals. For the rental program and reconstruction program, we have allocated $5 million. For the benefit to low to moderate, that would be $4 million. For the public and affordable housing program, we have allocated a total of $32 million, and we have told HUD that we would set aside $28 million in change to serve the low to moderate income individuals. Our supportive housing and sheltering program has an allocation of $5 million, and 100% would benefit low to moderate income individuals. So that takes care of our housing program. For infrastructure, we're looking at 3 activities. The local match for federal disaster recovery has an allocation of $50 million, $549,800. We have identified 60% of those funds to benefit low to moderate income individuals. Also under infrastructure is a road repair and resilience program. $30 million has been identified for that program. 65% of that $30 million would benefit low to moderate income individuals. The final program under this category is called the electrical power system, enhancement and improvement, which has a budget of $45 million. 80% of this fund will go to benefit low to moderate income individuals. So for those of you who are not familiar with the listing that I'm providing, a more detailed information would be further along into the program. For the economic revitalization program, we have identified 5 activities, and I'll tell you about them. For the Port and Airport Enhancement Program, we have identified $23 million. For this program, we have told HUD about 20% of those funds will benefit low to moderate income individuals. The Workforce Development Program, I skipped the program. Tourism Industry Support Program, I just realized that, has a budget of $5 million, and 20% of that budget will also benefit low to moderate income individuals. But the Workforce Development Program that I jumped to by error, it has a budget of $5 million, but 100% of this funding is going to benefit low to moderate income individuals. We have 2 programs that are not funded right now in our action plan. It is Neighborhood Revitalization and the Small Business and Entrepreneurship Technical Assistance Program. Now, these programs will eventually be funded. Why we have not funded them at this time is that we're trying to finalize our policies and procedures and finalize the activities that will go into these programs. The programs I've mentioned and all the information that I'll be discussing today are all found on our website, and the website information is www.vihfa.gov. Under the header, you can click on disaster recovery, and all the disaster recovery information can be found on that tab. We're going to move on to the next page, and we're going to talk about our program sectors. So the first program is, of course, housing, one of our biggest and most important sectors. The activity description that I'm going to talk about first is the Homeowner Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Program. As I mentioned before, the total is $10 million. We have identified two types of activities for you, reconstruction and rehabilitation. For reconstruction is our priority, and it includes demolition and rebuilding of substantially damaged housing and modular units on the same lot, on the same footprint. This activity is capped at $250,000. The second priority under this program is called rehabilitation. Now, the program funds will be available to assist homeowners whose home received major and severe damage but did not meet the definition of destroyed or substantially damaged. For this activity, there will be a cap of $50,000. Our Envision program. Our Envision program seeks to move forward our two main housing activities under the housing program, the Homeowner Rehab and Reconstruction Program and the Rental Rehab and Reconstruction Program. These programs started on April 15th with call centers. Our Envision program is our case management system, and they started off with robocalls. They called persons who have registered with FEMA, persons who are involved into the STEP program, and calls were just to let people know that a third program has started, and if you are still in need of disaster damage, you are asked to call in, register for the program. We have 3 locations that I want to tell you about. On St. Thomas is at Tutu Park Mall. On St. John is at the Marketplace. And on St. Croix is right next to Health Conscious. So if you're still in need of disaster recovery assistance, you're asked to come into the case management centers at any one of those 3 locations. Or you can go to the website. The website is www.vistormrecovery.com. The case management hotline, I can give you that number, 888-239-3387. So on the next slide, I'm going to talk about the road to, or the pathway to recovery. So our Envision program is a 6-step process where we take the homeowner on a pathway to recovery. So all homeowners that are still in need of disaster recovery assistance, like I said, is asked to go to any one of the intake centers that I mentioned before, go to the website, or you could download the app via Storm Recovery, and you can fill out the application remotely as well. That's the first step in the process. The second step is the eligibility review. The applicant and the property goes through what we call an eligibility review to make sure the house was damaged as a result of the hurricane. So it has a tie to the disaster. The homeowner was living at the home at the time of the disaster. And the homeowner also has to go through what Marion talked about before, the duplication of benefits step. On the third step of this process is called the inspection and assessment. A preliminary damage assessment and environmental review will be conducted at this time. This is where we go to the site, we look at the damages undertaken from the hurricane, and we create a cost estimate for repair. Once this step is done, the homeowner can then move to the award letter. After a final duplication of benefit analysis is done to verify other funding sources from the homeowner as received, an award determination is made. Then the homeowner will be notified, and the homeowner can then move to signing that grant agreement and being on the pathway to construction. Construction is the 5th step in the process. Once construction starts, the program would have inspectors on site on a regular basis to monitor the work done by the contractors. Once the construction is finished, the home is completed. That's the 6th and final step. And at this step, we look at the closeout, final payment to the contractor, getting the homeowner back in the home. So that concludes the pathway to recovery. So our second activity is a new construction for homeownership opportunity for first-time home buyers. As I mentioned before, it is $10 million. Here's the eligibility criteria for that program. We're looking for displaced home buyers who can show that they are mortgage ready with income less than and equal to 120% of the area median income will be prioritized. Only those households with income up to 80% of the AMI may qualify as meeting the low-income benefit national objective. This program is capped at $325,000. We're going on to activity description number 3, the Rental Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Program. This funding is $5 million. The program seeks to repair and reconstruct rental units damaged from Hurricane Irma and Maria. Priority 1, we're looking for applicants that must meet the following criteria. Units that are major and severely damaged and vacant. Units served must be reserved for LMI tenants with a priority for housing voucher holders. Rental units with outstanding needs not met by insurance proceeds or other disaster recovery benefits. Our second priority is similar to the first. The main difference is that the first one is units that are major and severely damaged and units that are occupied. As additional funds become available, other priority needs will be awarded. For our fourth activity description, this is a public and affordable housing development. Under Tranche 1, the program is $32 million. The program seeks to redevelop and create new affordable rental housing stock, including subsidized and mixed income rental units. Now, the DR program will pay for affordable rental housing development, project-based subsidized and affordable units for LMI clients, subsidies for costs of rehabilitating vacant properties up to 40 rental units, and more. Activity description number 5 under our housing program is a supportive housing and sheltering program. $15 million has been set aside for this activity. The program will fund eligible rehabilitation and reconstruction activities, support expansion of new development of units for the vulnerable population, enable providers to support vulnerable population through the provision of services. And let me tell you who the vulnerable population can include. We're looking at seniors, the homeless. We're also looking at the disabled. Anyone that can fit in that category will be considered a vulnerable population. So that concludes the housing activities. We're going to move to infrastructure program. Under infrastructure, our first activity description is the local match for the federal disaster relief program. That funding right now is $50 million, $549,800. The program will provide a cost share for DR activities, including the FEMA PA Public Assistance, and the PMD programs. FEMA pays 90% of the project. The DR program has pledged to provide 10% of the program for the total project cost of 100%. This program will serve funding of the last resort after eligibility determination has been made, and all programs go through a duplication of benefits analysis. Homeowners go through it, as well as subrecipients go through it. And I'm going to tell you about subrecipients in the upcoming slides later on. Our second activity under the infrastructure program is called the Infrastructure Repair and Resilience Program. The funding for this activity is $30 million. The program will cover eligible costs to cover repairs, replacement for public infrastructure that have not been completed or addressed or covered under FEMA. Activities to harden infrastructure against severe weather events. The next activity under the infrastructure program is the Electrical Power System Enhancement and Improvement Program. We have allotted $45 million for this activity. The program will invest in optimizing the generation mix of our power utility system, improving asset productivity, providing more sustainable, more reliable, and more cost-effective energy for the USVI. That concludes our infrastructure program. I'm now going to move on to the economic revitalization program. Our activity description number 1 is a port and airport enhancement project. We have allocated $23 million to this activity. The geographical area is the entire territory, but more specifically, we have identified Schooner Bay Channel on St. Croix, Delta Maya Harbor on St. Thomas, Crown Bay Harbor on St. Thomas as well. The program will improve maritime and air connectivity for the USVI to increase cruise ship arrivals and to increase air traffic to the territory. Both initiatives are key to rebuilding tourism sector in the economy, as the VI main industry is the tourism. The next activity under our Economic Revitalization Program is the Tourism Industry Support Program. As mentioned before, I think when Marion did her presentation, she mentioned projects that are ineligible. Any activity that benefits tourism is usually an ineligible activity. However, the VI requested a waiver to HUD to allow us to undertake this activity, and it was granted. So in this activity, we have allocated $5 million, and the program will provide funding for tourism marketing campaigns and funding to support tourism-related business and entrepreneurs. We have broken down the $5 million into 2 activities, and the maximum award for the tourism marketing program is $4 million, and for the business support, we have identified $1 million. Also under this economic revitalization program is the workforce development program, $5 million. The program will provide workforce training to help local residents take advantage of employment opportunities created through the investment of disaster recovery funds. Training programs will be provided in the soft skills and hard skills. Opportunities to engage. I think this is something that everyone wants to hear about. Under opportunities for engage, possible roles include subrecipients. When the DR funds were given to the territory, they were given to the VIHFA. Some of the programs VIHFA will undertake on its own, and I'll discuss them in a little on other slides. Other activities, we will engage with what we call subrecipients. Subrecipients are selected by the grantee using a specific criteria. Now, they also have responsibility for programmatic decision-making. They are also responsible for the federal program requirements, and they are also responsible for performance monitored by the grantee. Another opportunity to engage with VIHFA is through a contractor. This is done competitively, procured, and provides specific scope of services. Does not have to be a for-profit or private sector entity. It can be a nonprofit. Additional roles include a developer. Awarded funds for an affordable housing development can be either a for-profit or nonprofit entity, typically organized and or formed for a single purpose or undertaking a specific activity, such as a rental or a home buyer project. Also, additional roles include businesses, private or publicly held for-profit entity receiving funds as a beneficiary under the program, such as a business loan program. Subcontractors can also participate into the program as through a contractor. Some contractors are contracted through the prime contractor. They are part of the prime contractor's team identified in the proposal, or they're part of the prime contractor's team selected after the award has been given. May be well equipped to provide a piece of the services required to undertake the activity. So potentially, some of our implementing agencies for the DR funds may include the following. So under housing, The Homeowner Rehab and Reconstruction Program that I mentioned earlier, VIHFA is undertaking this activity ourselves. We are undertaking this activity through contractors that we hired to do various services. For the new construction for home buyer assistance, again, VIHFA is the implementing entity. As I said before, this program mimics our traditional program, and we typically provide these services at VIHFA. The Rental Rehabilitation and Reconstruction Program, we're sharing this activity with the Virgin Islands Housing Authority. The Public and Affordable Housing Development, VIHFA is an implementing entity. The Virgin Islands Housing Authority, as well as potential developers, are implementing entities. For supportive housing and sheltering programs, we're looking for the Department of Human Services. Our nonprofits are in territory that are serving the vulnerable population. I'm going to move on to the next slide. For infrastructure, we have some implementing entities identified. For the local match for federal disaster recovery, VITEMA is a potential subrecipient, as well as any one of the 53 agencies listed under the VI government. Infrastructure repair and resilience, we're looking for Department of Public Works, WAPA, for example, VINGN, Waste Management, and that's just to name a few. The list can go on. For the electrical power system and enhancements, improvements, WAPA, solely identified for WAPA. On the next slide, we have identified potential implementing entities for the Economic Revitalization Program. For our port and airport enhancement project, we are partnering with the Virgin Islands Port Authority and also WICO, the West Indian Company organization. For the Tourism Industry Support Program, the sole entity will be the Department of Tourism. For the workforce development, we have tagged Department of Labor as the lead. However, Department of Labor will also be working with the Workforce Development Board, Department of Education, EDA, UVI, and any nonprofit that has a certification to be able to perform workforce development. The two programs that are what you have, neighborhood revitalization and small business, we don't have an implementing agency identified as yet. As I said, we're still working through our policies to identify who those entities may be. The relationship to the grantee, and for this case, the grantee is the USVI, Housing Finance Authority. Well, we have two categories here. You can either be a subrecipient, a contractor/developer. The selection process may be this as well. For the subrecipient, we're going to designate it either by an application or another selection method based on the activity identified. For contractor or developer, selected through a competitive procurement process in accordance with 2 CFR 200. Now, applicable requirements include subrecipients are subject to all applicable administrative, financial, and cross-cutting rules. The contractor and developer, they're subject to the requirements for this that is specified in the scope of work or what is specified in their contract. For monitoring and performance, subrecipients must adhere to written agreements outlining responsibilities. The recipient monitors all aspects of the program. And for the contractor and developer, they must deliver services identified in the contract. The next slide shows us the subrecipient process flow. Although it's cut in half, I will go through what it says briefly. The first step in the process is to do a capacity assessment. And at this stage, we're looking at receiving information from the potential subrecipient that may include accounting policies and procedures, retention policies, systems of internal control, procurement. It pretty much goes through the same process the VI Housing Finance Authority went through to receive this grant. As mentioned earlier by Marion, HUD required that VHFA conducted a capacity assessment. We also require that our subrecipients go through a capacity assessment as well, just to make sure that you are a good steward of DR funds. So after the capacity assessment is done, we develop what we call your subrecipient agreement. And this is a binding agreement that allows your entity and the VIHFA to be partners in the recovery effort. Once we have the subrecipient developed, we go to the DR application stage. And these can be done simultaneously. They do not have to go in an order of 1, 2, and 3. At the capacity level, we can also discuss your DR application and your subrecipient agreement. The next stage in this process is the environmental review stage. As Marion said in a prior slide, environmental review is required for all activities that DR funds are funding. And based on the level of based on the type of project, we go through various levels of environmental review. Some projects can be exempt, and some projects go through a full environmental review just based on the activity. After the environmental review stage is completed, we go through what we call a project agreement. So the subrecipient agreement is an umbrella blanket agreement that just binds us together. But what brings on your project for DR funding is the project addendum stage. This is where we're able to clearly identify your project from the application stage, and we gather that information from the application, we put it into your project agreement, and it is formalized into what we call a project addendum, and then we give you what we call a notice to proceed. From this notice to proceed, you're able to start work on DR. So I went through the capacity assessment earlier, and this slide just tells you about what are some of the things we go through in a capacity assessment, but we go through a lot more. We looked at staffing headcount, internal controls, your policies and procedures for grant management, accounting procedures, procurement, record retention. We looked at whether or not you, the subrecipient, has ever received grant funding, results of any federal or internal audits. We looked at how you handle fraud, waste, and abuse, and if you're aware of detecting fraud, waste, and abuse, your reliance on outside contractors, and conflict of interest. The DR application includes information that we would need, like I said, to develop your project agreement. The DR application will have a detailed description of the proposed project, a description of how your project is tied to the disaster, the national objective your project will adhere to. We will go through a duplication of benefit analysis on your project, environmental review, and a budget is needed, and this budget is itemized. We itemize to show the project cost, and this cost can include construction, planning, activities. We also include activity delivery costs and administrative costs, if administrative cost is available for your project. The subrecipient agreement, this is a sample of how one would look like. HUD regulates on 24 CFR 570-503. It requires that grantees enter into a formal written agreement with each subrecipient before spending any DR funds. So once the subrecipient agreement is signed, you have a project agreement, and you have a notice to proceed is issued to you, our office starts oversight and monitoring. HUD requires the grantee, us, to monitor you. Similarly, HUD will monitor our files. We do a desk monitoring. We also do on-site monitoring, and we go to the project site. Grantee must conduct a risk assessment that provides TA to the subrecipient if needed. So anytime during the course of your program, if you need technical assistance, the DR program stands available to assist you. During the course of the monitoring, we're going to look at your program performance. Is the program reaching its intended clients? Is it work being done in a timely manner. We're also going to monitor you financially. Is the request for payment consistent with the level of accomplishment of funds being drawn on for eligible activities? Regulatory requirements are going to be looked at as well. Is the statutory regulations being met, such as what Marion talked about, the Davis-Bacon, the Section 3, the fair housing? Are adequate records being maintained at your office? Reporting and record keeping. We expect that all subrecipients submit monthly reports to our office and have some level of document retention. Records are retained in your office 3 years following the grant closeout of DR. Although your project may close prior to our grant closeout, you're required to hold those same files until the DR program has closed all our files. Things that should be included in your records include contracts, correspondences, scopes of work, reports, payments with supporting documents, payrolls, federal cross-cutting reporting requirements, and any other document that will support your activity. Well, that concludes my presentation, Jelani, and I thank you again. We now have questions and answers.
Thank you so much, Ms. Fleming. Thanks to everyone for all of the questions. We have a lot of questions to get through, so we'll spend the rest of the time today on the webinar doing the question and answer session. Many of the questions focused on the process of developing the action plan. So I thought it would be best to group those questions together and ask you, Ms. Fleming, to just talk a little bit about the action plan development process and particularly how the funding allocations were determined for each program.
Okay, so during when the action plan was being developed, HUD had put in the Federal Register notice that the most impacted areas were housing, infrastructure, and economic revitalization. So when we looked at the housing program, we looked at what was really damaged on the territory. We saw single-family homes were damaged. We also saw renters were displaced. Multifamily buildings were damaged, and renters in those programs, in those housing were displaced. The homeless was also displaced, and people who had damaged homes were displaced. We looked at creating programs that would address all these needs. That's why we created the Homeowner Rehab and Reconstruction Program. And the VIHFA undertakes the New Construction Program, so we mimic a program to follow that as well. The Homeowner Program will serve single-family homes, as I said, that were damaged as a result of the hurricane. The rental program, when we looked at the things that happened after the disaster, FEMA came around and provided assistance to single-family homes. In our discussions, we didn't find where FEMA assisted landlords, and we needed a program to serve those people as well. The Supportive Housing and Sheltering Program, we talked about serving the vulnerable population, was also included in that line item is the sheltering. After the hurricane, the territory used the schools to shelter anyone that needed assistance. And after the hurricane, the schools were placed in a predicament where they couldn't open after the hurricane because the buildings were still used as a shelter. Also, churches were still used as a shelter. Well, this line item will also provide an opportunity to provide a structure that is multi-use and at the time of the event be used as a shelter. So we will not be dependent on education to use their schools anymore. So this is the underlying plan. When we looked at housing, we looked at the needs, the unmet needs for the territory, and how we can best serve those needs. I hope that answers your question, Jelani.
Great, thanks so much. There were also a number of questions about whether the slides would be made available after the webinar, and yes, the slides as well as the recording of the webinar will be distributed via email in the days following the event. We also received a handful of questions on duplication of benefits, so I'm going to direct those questions to Marion. The first question on duplication of benefits was, do states have to estimate how much insurance proceeds will offset losses in their plan? Because California says that HUD insists that this number is higher than it likely is.
So generally, at the high level, statewide, those kinds of calculations are going to come into place when HUD is determining how much money to give to a state, such as California. So I have not seen that a state itself has to estimate after they receive the funding. Then it turns to looking at an individual analysis of property owner by property owner. But let's back up to how HUD makes the funding available. So HUD is going to look at multiple data sources to try to determine a number reflective of how much unmet need is there in a jurisdiction. So HUD actually has the discretion to determine who's going to receive the money at the government level. So HUD can make the funding available to a state, it can make it available to a county, to a territory, to a tribe, to a local government like a city. So that's the first decision that's being made by HUD. And then the next decision is, okay, well, how much money is going to move? And so HUD will look at the best available data sources, which generally are going to be FEMA and SBA determinations of unmet need. So FEMA and SBA are going to be putting some dollar value on the amount they think is insured and uninsured, but it's not going to go to the individual property level. After the money has moved from the federal government to the grantee, the grantee is then going to look on a property-by-property basis. So I think the answer to your question is no, they're not going to require that of the jurisdiction after they receive the funding, but it may be part of the negotiations up front where HUD lets a jurisdiction know it looks like this is the amount of need we see, and provides the jurisdiction some ability to come back and say, wait, you're undercounting the damage or you're overestimating the amount of insurance. There can be some informal back and forth before HUD announces new grants.
Great. Also on duplication of benefits, a clarifying question, does duplication of benefits include private insurance funding home insurance?
Yes, absolutely, and that tends to be the first source that will be looked at when there's a repair program going on.
Yep. And third on duplication of benefits, if a person applies and receives an SBA loan, they would only be eligible for the amount not covered by SBA. But what if the resident should have applied for an SBA loan but didn't? Would that resident be eligible for CDBG-DR?
So now we're getting into the hornet's nest. So this is one of the toughest issues in CDBG-DR, and there's no one simple answer here because the policy has changed over time. So it used to be that, I mean, we're talking like a decade ago, that jurisdictions could make their own choices about whether CDBG-DR funds could be used to pay off SBA loans. And if folks don't know, the Small Business Administration does make post-disaster loans available to homeowners. It's not just for businesses. So generally after disaster, some homeowners will go immediately to the SBA and get in the line for a low-interest loan because they want to start rebuilding immediately. But some people don't do that because they don't know, because they know they won't qualify, or they know that they won't be able to afford to make an additional loan payment on top of their regular mortgage payments, or possibly because they're going to wait and see if grant funding becomes available. So over time, that policy at the federal level has shifted from jurisdictions, you can make your own choices about what to do, to HUD saying, you know what, as a matter of policy, we're going to say you cannot pay off a CDBG-DR, an SBA loan with CDBG-DR. HUD wrote a policy about that in 2011, and that was the rule. But since we have seen Congress step forward in the DRRA, Disaster Recovery and something else with an R Act, to say that federal benefits that SBA loans shouldn't be considered a duplication of benefits. So as we understand it, the new HUD policy is to say you can pay off an SBA loan. But there's still some decision making that can happen at the local level So I defer to Antoinette on the USVI policy on DOB. I'm sorry for a long-winded answer to a short question, Jelani.
No worries. Ms. Fleming, is there anything that you would like to add to that response from a local perspective?
So right now our duplication of benefits assessment is done by our case management firm, and those will be done on a case-by-case basis, so I'm going to refer the response to that by our case manager. So if a homeowner has specific duplication of benefits question, please visit any one of our case management centers or call the 888 number that I mentioned before.
There were a handful of questions about eligibility. So I'm going to ask these questions and ask that Marion, respond from the CDBG-DR national program perspective, and Ms. Fleming, if you could respond to the extent that there's information on how it aligns or doesn't with the VI's action plan and funding programs. The first was clarification. We had mentioned that government buildings are not eligible. Does this mean that government house and their offices are not eligible for CDBG-DR funding?
I'm sorry, the government?
Government house in the VI, which is the House of Government.
Oh, yes, sorry. I was thinking like an individual's home who worked for the government.
No, sorry.
Right, so generally, no. The question would be, was it disaster impacted, and can they make the case to HUD for a waiver? But generally, no, those buildings are going to be ineligible, and that would include the legislative branch.
And that is correct. We would have to write a waiver to HUD, requesting HUD to allow us to do any DR work on government house or any public-facing building that has the conduct of government operations in it.
Okay. Another question on eligibility of the funds. Does this apply to houses of worship?
So HUD does permit assistance to houses of worship under very constrained circumstances. So there is an entire rule in the regular CDBG program, which applies as well to the disaster funding, about looking at what the facility that's being renovated for, or the specific room or rooms within the facility are used for. And there has to be a separation between the inherently religious activities like worship or Bible study and the non-religious activities. And that separation can be time or space. So for example, if you're looking at the rehabilitation of, let's say you have a church that has an adjacent community meeting space. The chapel area, if it's always used as the chapel, the primary place of worship, that's not going to be eligible for rehab. But let's say it shares the roof with the rest of the building, which is used part of the time for religious-only gatherings and part of the time for open to the community non-religious gatherings. Some portion of that roof could be paid for. It would just be, everyone would have to get their pencils and calculators out to determine how much of the cost is attributable to the eligible activities. So for example, we see funds will flow to places of worship that operate a homeless shelter, a soup kitchen, or have a gym that's open to the public or otherwise share their facilities.
Okay. Great. Next question. Are costs associated with the replacement of mobile homes eligible for CDBG-DR funds? And it's a two-part question. Could a mobile home destroyed by the storm be eligible for a stick-built house through CDBG-DR?
From the national perspective, absolutely. We see that done routinely. Sometimes a jurisdiction will look at the cost of rebuilding and determine that money would be better spent on doing a stick-built home, or that might be more suitable for the family that's living there. Certainly when we're looking at properties in a floodplain, we see jurisdictions that have determined that it's better to do stick-built and do the elevation than trying to elevate a pad on which a mobile home sits.
Okay.
But again, that's going to be subject to local decision-making.
Great. Okay.
And Marion is correct. When we did our research with mobile homes in the territory, we contacted a manufacturer and we told them we have about 100 or so potential mobile homes in the territory that may need to be repaired or replaced. And their concern was the shipping and having a very high expensive shipping cost. So from the program decision points, we determined we were not going to be able to replace a mobile home with a mobile home. And as Marion said, it was better that we replace a mobile home with a stick-built home.
Okay. The following questions get into the specifics of information resources and the various programs, and we did get a large number of questions. We'll get through as many of them as we can on the webinar today, but please note that the system does record all of the questions, and for questions that we either don't have time to get to or don't have the information at hand to be able to answer, we'll be able to follow up with folks directly via email. Okay. The next question, what is the waiver process for new construction, and how can I research or find guidance on this?
So HUD has granted waivers for new...
Go ahead, Marion.
Sorry, after you, Antoinette. No, you, please.
I was just going to say the waiver request that the VIHFA requested was specifically to address new construction for first-time home buyers. And that is the second activity in our housing program. We actually wrote a letter to HUD, and it was included in the Federal Register notice that allowed us to participate and use this type of activity.
And generally what happens behind the scenes, once a disaster has been really significant and HUD starts taking a look at its data, it will have informal conversations with jurisdictions and suggest to them, here are the kinds of waivers that other communities have looked at. Some of them we grant automatically. We just know we're going to publish it in the Federal Register and make it available. Others, maybe you want to consider what you'd want to ask for, and so that discussion happens, and those waivers have been granted for the VI.
Great. Next question. In a sub-grantee capacity, are prevailing wages required for subs? Also, two-part question. That's the first part. Second part, who is responsible for environmental reviews, grantees or subrecipients? So, Marion, you want to take the first crack, and then Antoinette can.
Sure. Very complicated questions.
Okay.
So can you repeat the first question, please?
Yeah. In a sub-grantee capacity, are prevailing wages required for subs?
Generally, yes. The requirements will follow down to the sub-grantee level.
Great. And then, Ms. Fleming, who's responsible for environmental reviews, grantees or subrecipients?
The grantee is responsible for the environmental review. VIHFA is the responsible entity, and Mr. Griffith, the director of the authority, is the responsible entity. And what we have been doing thus far is, based on the description that's submitted to us by the potential subrecipient in the CDBG-DR application, our environmental team starts the review process.
Great. Okay, thank you. Okay.
One thing I would just add to that while you queue up the next question, Jelani, is that though it is the VIHFA or the VI that's doing the environmental review, the subrecipient has to live by it and is responsible for complying with environmental review requirements. And if the subrecipient does not comply with environmental requirements, those funds would be subject to clawback by the VI. So while the subrecipient isn't doing the environmental review, they are still responsible for compliance with the laws.
Next question. Under what area of funding does a request for clearance or demolition of a building that is a hazard for the community fall? And that's a question for you, Ms. Fleming.
On which category? Well, it's not necessarily which category, it's what type of activity. So it's what type of activity are we doing to do demolition? Is it a housing structure? Is it under infrastructure, or is it under economic revitalization? And in some of these categories, some of these program activities, demolition of a building is eligible, but is the end result of the activity that we would like to know. When we demolish a building, that itself is not eligible, but the end use of the proposed reconstruction of a new building, that is where the eligibility comes in. Will the building be used for the conduct of public service, like homeless services, or an after-school program, or any other eligible activity? That is what we would like to know.
Okay, great. The next question is about the rental rehabilitation or reconstruction program. Are landlords supposed to meet the income limit or just the tenant? Who is the applicant?
So the applicant right now is the landlord. And what we're trying to do under this program is the landlord, to answer the second question, no, landlords don't have to do an income determination. In this activity, once we invested up to $50,000 of DR recovery monies into the unit, we're asking the landlord to rent to an LMI tenant. So the units served will be reserved for LMI tenants with a priority for housing voucher holders.
Great. Thank you. Next question. When does the VI Housing Finance Authority expect to make awards under the multifamily activities of Tranche 1? Are any projects underway?
One moment, let me move to that slide, Larry, sorry.
No worries.
So the multifamily or the public and affordable housing, I think, is the person is referring to. And as I mentioned, that is for Housing Authority, Housing Finance Authority, and developers. As of this moment, the Virgin Islands Housing Authority has an executed subrecipient agreement with VIHFA, and we are working on developing 4 project agreements for VI Housing Authority, and that is to undertake one of several, four programs that they have. Tutu High-Rise, redevelopment. We have some work at Dishabert. We have some work at Walter I. M. Hodge, and I cannot remember the 4th program. So, and for the developers, we're also working with Megan's Bay Junction.
Great. Okay. Next question, and I'll give this one to Marion. In general, how long does HUD take to approve waivers?
So at the beginning of a grant, a lot of the waivers will be baked into the Federal Register notice. So Congress makes the funding available to HUD, and HUD publishes the waivers in the Federal Register along with the general rules for the use of the grant. So that's some period of months from the time of the appropriation. If after that a jurisdiction comes forward asking HUD for a waiver, it can take anywhere from generally a month to multiple months, depending on the novelty of the waiver and how much process is required getting approval across HUD.
Okay. Great. Okay. For Ms. Fleming, is the administration cost limited at 10% of the total budget submitted?
For Tranche 1, yes, it is. Each tranche has their own planning budget and administration budget. So for Tranche 1, it is capped at that amount.
Okay, great. And another follow-up question. What is the estimated timeline between proposal submission and capacity review or approval?
Well, that is all dependent upon the potential subrecipient and their ability to give us the required documentation. So if a subrecipient does not have internal controls or policies and procedures, that will delay the start of moving on to the next step. And each potential subrecipient is very different.
All right, great. Another two-part question. Is it correct that the rental unit assistance program can only be used to rehab affordable housing? And second part of that question is part of that question, if so, how long do these units have to be designated affordable housing, and how is the rent control determined?
Okay. So let's go on to the first question. The first question deals with, repeat the first question?
Oh, yep. Just confirming the understanding that the rental unit assistance program can only be used to rehab affordable housing.
Okay. So the rental program that we have proposed for the territory is for any rental unit that a landlord has experienced hurricane damage and still needs assistance for. So income determination is not done on the landlord at all. What is happening is after our investment into the unit, we ask that the landlord reserve the unit that we have invested in to low-income persons with a priority for the Housing Choice Voucher client. The affordability period, I think, is the second question. So there's many housing units in the territory. For a housing unit between 2 to 15 units, 2 to 12 units, is a 15-year affordability period, and that is statutory. That was placed in the Federal Register notice. The territory can reduce, I'm sorry, I'll retract it. The statutory requirement is for units that is 7 to 12 units. Any units less than 7, the territory has determined that we would have an affordability period of 10 years.
Okay. All right, great, thank you. Next question. We are a nonprofit. Is there an office on St. Croix where we could go in to discuss our infrastructure project ideas to see if they would qualify for funding under CDBG-DR?
So our office on St. Croix is located in Frederickstead. That is the Housing Finance Authority office. And that is a building adjacent to what was the legislature on St. Croix.
Okay. Great. All right. And I think we've come down to the last of the questions. Can you clarify what is a stick-built home?
So that's going to refer to construction that's generally done on site rather than off-site construction. So thinking of more than a minimal amount of on-site construction required.
Okay. Great. Thank you. With that, I think...
Oh, I would say, just to clarify, that doesn't mean that it has to be sticks. It could be cement block. It could be any other method, just that it refers to being done on-site rather than off-site.
Right. Okay. All right. With that, I think we've gotten through all of our questions. If you had a question that you weren't able to ask, or if we somehow missed your question, you can reach out to either of the presenters with your question. The contact information is on the screen. I'll ask our presenters if they have anything they'd like to say just in closing before we wrap up the webinar.
I would just like to say, this is Marion. It's great to get this robust level of engagement around the programming, and Enterprise is here for you if you have any additional questions. Thanks, everyone.
I also want to thank Enterprise for this opportunity, thank Marion for the time well spent, and thank everyone for their participation and their questions. Like Jelani said, if there are any questions, I think my contact information is on the slide, and we are available to assist the territory in any which way.